Welcome to the Your Voice is Your Power podcast, where we amplify real conversations about mental health for youth and young adults. Today, we're diving into a topic that's not just important, but necessary: navigating mental health and self advocacy as BIPOC youth. For a lot of people of color, a lot of young people of color, speaking up about mental health can feel like you're pushing up against years of silence, stigma, systemic barriers. But self advocacy, the ability to recognize your needs and speak up for them, is a very powerful tool for change. So, joining me today are two incredible leaders who are not only navigating their own mental health journeys, but are also creating change for others. So, we're going to talk about challenges, the wins, some of the lessons we've learned along the way. Uh, and I'm excited to dive in. So, let me introduce our guests: Chigozie, a master candidate at Boston University School of Public Health, concentrating in epidemiology, biostatistics, and mental health and substance use. Chigozie's passion for mental health is deeply personal, inspired by friends, family members with lived experience. Their work focuses on mental health advocacy and literacy, especially for youth of color. They are passionate about exploring non-clinical approaches to engaging young people of color in meaningful mental health conversations and support. When not making an impact in the field, you just heard about that impact. Chigozie enjoys baking, reading, and running. Nicole is from Virginia and recently graduated from the University of Virginia with a bachelor's degree in psychology. Go Nicole! In the fall semester, she interned with Active Minds as a community programs intern, where she collaborated with our Speakers Bureau team in the Sin Science Packing program. Nicole is deeply passionate about mental health advocacy, particularly among Black youth, and exploring how systemic factors affect racial equality, especially in healthcare, and their impact on mental health outcomes for Black communities. She is currently applying to a Master of Science in Nursing programs with the goal of advancing racial equality in healthcare through research, patient care, and policy work. So let me just take a moment to honor the greatness that is on the call. Nicole and Chigozie, I so appreciate y'all joining us. Let me just start out. How y'all feel? How y'all feeling today?
I'm feeling pretty good. Yeah, excited to be here. So thanks for having me.
Honored to have you. Nicole, what about you?
Oh yeah, I'm feeling good. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I think it's something that we both have a lot to say about. So I'm excited.
Likewise. I mean, I just read bios. Y'all are extremely talented, intelligent, busy people. So I hope y'all have had an opportunity to center yourself before this conversation. But I'm definitely excited to dive in. This is a free-flowing conversation. So please, I have questions prepared, but we're going to allow the conversation to take its own course. But let's just start off. Can you share a moment when you first became aware of the importance of mental health in your own life?
Yeah, I think for me, I became aware of it when I started to struggle with it myself. In my house, it wasn't really a conversation that was had. Mental health, therapy, anything kind of that nature. I think part of it was because my parents being from a country where mental health isn't really a topic, it was hard for them to understand, but also hard for me to kind of come to terms with in terms of why am I feeling this way? Why does it seem like I'm struggling and other people aren't? Like, what does this mean? What can I do to kind of get help? And kind of having to navigate that on my own taught me a lot about mental health and self advocacy specifically in a space where at home it wasn't necessarily something that I could do or talk about. I kind of learned to do it through school and organizations, and getting interested in the psychology field and learning more about it from that sphere, I think really helped me to understand kind of the idea that you're not alone, but also that not only can this be something difficult socially, but also there is this clinical, physical, mental aspects of mental health in terms of chemical imbalances and trauma and how that affects the brain and things like that. And I think that just gave me a lot of comfort to know that not only do a lot of things go into mental health, but it's something that there's a whole field on, and it just made it feel very real for me and made me kind of understand that it isn't something to be stigmatized, but more something to be seen kind of in the sphere of holistic health, which is something that I've been kind of passionate about. So
I love that.
Yeah, for me, the moment I kind of first became aware was watching my brothers kind of struggle with their mental health, as they're the youngest and I'm the second oldest. So there's a bit of an age gap, but just like watching them go through their own journey. And then I'm also from like an immigrant family, Nigerian specifically. So it's kind of like something that's not really talked about as well. And I was able to like kind of see they need a bit more support in aspects of their life, but I it's like I don't really know how to advocate for them in the household where you don't really talk about something like that. So that's kind of like what started this mental health journey for me, just kind of watching them go through that and not kind of feeling powerless in a way. And I'm like 16, I have other siblings as well. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but just kind of like watching them go through their journey and trying to understand the resources available, but not really feeling like I was empowered to access those resources for other people, if that makes sense.
It really does. When you said, really recognizing it in someone else, and really when you care about someone, and they're struggling, you want to figure out what that struggle is. Why are they
Mhm.
struggling? And oftentimes within BIPOC communities, specifically within Black communities, mental health is the thing that we look at last. When it's the thing that we should look at first. To your
Yeah.
point around trauma and all the other factors that play into our mental health, and y'all kind of led into my second question by talking about this silence in the home. And as a young Black man, I reflect on that. My mother did the best she could, but like we didn't talk about mental health. And I feel like that's a challenge often faced in recognizing and addressing mental health as a BIPOC youth. So speak more about that challenge, not necessarily having a place at home, and to both of your points, having to start that self-advocacy journey because of that silence.
Yeah, I think for me, my parents are from Ghana, which is like West Africa, as well. And I think it was difficult for them, and I give them a lot of grace now as I'm older, but I think it was difficult for them because coming to a new country with a completely different culture, with like no family, and like trying to navigate finances and making a life and having kids and having just been married, like I think that can be a hard thing to balance. And I think now as I've grown up, I understand it's like there is somewhat of a luxury in the United States to be able to have a little bit more of a focus on mental health, because I think that in other countries, like that really can't be the first thing they look at. Just with other issues going on, like in Ghana, like they're struggling in terms of their political like turmoil, in terms of like what's it called, like corruption and things like that, and how that like is affecting taxes and all these things for them. But then also struggling with their like currency and how that can affect how expensive things are. So like there's these other factors that they're having to think about first, and it kind of reminds me of kind of the idea of like the Maslow hierarchy, where it's like you have to meet your basic needs first. And like for a lot of people, and like for my household, mental health wasn't considered a basic need, which I think is an interesting like thing to think about. And I think as I've gotten older and as I've seen me interact with my parents more and seeing them also struggle in ways that have kind of had to do with their mental health, it's interesting to think about how if maybe that was something that we looked at first, kind of like what you were talking about, like as being one of the basic needs versus looking at it last, like how much more that could have affected like the things that they struggled with maybe coming to this country. And I think that could have probably helped a lot more of the silence if it was more included in the conversation, like everything else was like other struggles, and like seeing it more as like, oh, we struggle with finances, we also struggle with mental health, like these are struggles that we're all having, versus mental health being this taboo thing of like, oh no, but we don't talk about that. I think that could have helped in terms of the silence. And I think also just having like for me, I think being that person in my family, that self-advocate, has honestly helped kind of create more of a space where it can be talked about, because I have two younger brothers, and it's a conversation that I feel very open talking to them about. And I talk about it with my parents, which 10 years ago, I would have never done that. But like now it's like something that I feel comfortable talking more about. I think that as they are more acclimated to this culture too, like Western society, they can understand more like what the actual implications of mental health are, and like also how it could have affected their parents or their siblings or friends that they had, even though it wasn't talked about. So I think that is kind of like why it's important to have like self-advocates in your family, and being able to like be willing to listen to. I think on the like part of my parents and my family has been something that I've seen a change in them in terms of like what the silence looks like in our house.
Yeah. And then also in terms of like silence, I feel like a lot of it was kind of um, if you did open up, one of the first things was kind of, at least in my household, was pray about it before you do anything else. And love prayer, I'm a Christian, but I think to a certain extent that also can kind of isolate people more, because when you come to someone or like, just I'm struggling, I have a problem, mom, dad, I need your help, and then the first response is, okay, go pray about it. For a 12-year-old, it just might feel like you're minimizing my voice, you're not hearing me, you're not seeing me, in a moment where it might have took a lot to even come and talk to you. So I think the silence and just like taking a moment, or at least looking back, I feel like it would have been very helpful just to have a moment of just like, okay, I see you, I hear what you're saying, like I'm trying to understand you. And even though I might not have the resources, maybe I can help you in that way. But to Nicole's point, also, our parents grew up in a completely different generation where their resources might have not, like the hierarchy of needs, mental health wasn't considered a priority. As long as you have a roof over your head, food on the table, what else can I really give you? Like, me providing is me showing you love. So like, I think that sentiment is something that I resonate with or grew up with as well.
I mean, you guys are already off to such a profound start. I think so many of the things that you guys have shared are so easily relatable. In BIPOC, you share the same story. I mean, I'm thinking about myself, Nicole, that meet your basic needs first hit home, because the basic need is making sure you got something to eat. The basic need is making sure that you got some clothes for school tomorrow. So that means I may need to go to the laundromat to get the clothes washed. And I grew up in America, but I've never been ashamed about my story. Grew up in a single single family household, mother only, a lot of siblings, and we did not necessarily have a lot of resources. And I often think about like the journey that my mother had to go through, and like, where did she prioritize her mental health? It wasn't prioritized because it was focused on meeting the needs of the household. But I want to, like, early on in this conversation, I want to name right now that as BIPOC youth, as a person of color, mental health is a part of your basic needs. You have the right to make sure that mental health is a part of that basic need. Just like you need food for your physical health, your mental health is just as important. And I'm so happy that we're having this conversation, because I feel like somebody's going to walk away being empowered to know that, no, my mental health is a part of that basic need. And then that pray about it, that hit home too, because it led to one of the questions that I had, which is around this idea of challenging stigma or misconceptions about mental health within your own community. Like, I don't know, Chigozie, if you want to speak more of that, or maybe Nicole, but like, how do you approach that? Because I'm someone who grew up in, religious families, very spiritual, it's personal for me now, right? But there are times where it's prayer and therapy. Okay,
Yeah.
it's prayer and I need to talk to somebody, or I need to implement some serious steps right now. So talk more about those misconceptions and those stigmas, and how do you approach challenging those?
I think one of my first approaches are just, I think it's kind of like, it doesn't have to be a binary. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Kind of like you said, it can be prayer and therapy, or prayer and a support group that's not religious. Like recognizing that we're all multifaceted, multidimensional people, and our religion or spirituality is a component of who we are, but for some people might not be everything. So just recognizing that, even just growing up, sorry, I jump around a lot, but like for the most part, like church was forced. So it wasn't something that like I chose to go to, like I had to go there. So it might not have been like the most place that I resonated the most with in a time of need, but maybe like a community group or a youth mental health group, like Active Minds, shout out. That would have been like a really more beneficial, a place that might have I don't know, been a better breeding ground or better environment for the mental health, as opposed to just solely looking at one aspect of our identities. So I guess kind of my answer to that question would be kind of looking at different aspects of our identities instead of just looking at one and expecting that one aspect to solve our entire life.
Yeah, kind of going off what you said, like she kind of worded it perfectly, especially when it comes to like the Christian perspective, which I also grew up in. I think this idea of prayer is interesting because it's like I also have heard the kind of fix of like pray and then it'll stop, or pray and seek wisdom. And it's like interesting because even within the Christian perspective, to where like I've understood it, it's like there's so many stories in the Bible where it's like, yeah, faith and works, but it seems like we always forget the works part. And so I think even with mental health, like that's something that is important, like it not being a binary of like, you can be religious and spiritual and like find relief or find strength in a higher being, but you can also like do the works to like help with that. Like it doesn't have to be a this or that. It can be both. And I think that that's like a really important thing to think about, especially with past generations. I think they struggle with that idea, especially past Christian generations specifically. They struggle with this idea of like, yes, you can be religious and pray, but you also have to do the works. Like if you're just praying and sitting around, like at least from how I grew up in the Christian like religion, like that's not doing enough. So I think it's interesting how it seems that with that specific point, it's always let's pray and this will go away, when like there's so many stories that say that you have to pray and you have to do the work. So I don't know. I think that's just something that's interesting.
No, I think that's very profound and powerful, and holding them to the word, right? But I think oftentimes, as BIPOC youth, it's like, okay, what is the work? Like oftentimes we don't even know how to get started. And I think one of the misconceptions that I have, faced as a former educator, and really that I have owned advocating for, working with active minds, working for active minds, is this misconception around like mental health is around the clinician side of things. So the work is therapy, or the work is, getting the child diagnosed with something. That's not necessarily the work. Mental health is making sure that, you are able to recognize triggers. Mental health is making sure that you're able to recognize the things that really take you on an emotional roller coaster, or even within your own household that, okay, I know I'm going to have a tough and difficult conversation with my parent. So I'm going to choose to have this conversation in a neutral place, because I just want to make sure that as best as possible, I'm able to navigate this conversation without feeling anxiety, without feeling stress, without feeling overwhelmed in this moment. So it's not always, around like, are you talking to a therapist, or do you have a diagnosis? It's like, no, do you actually know how to center your own mental health and some of the things that you need for yourself? And that's self-advocacy is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight, but some of the things that y'all named around this consciousness is really, really key. I wonder if y'all could share like what strategies as young youth advocates, as BIPOC advocates, what strategies have helped y'all communicate your mental health needs to parents, teachers, even healthcare providers?
I think this is a really interesting question because I know, at least like me 5 years ago, when I thought of mental health, like most people, it's like mental health is mental illness. And it's like, no, like there's mental health is like the idea of like taking care of your like mental. It's not necessarily this idea of like you have a mental illness, you need to like kind of navigate that. And I think with being BIPOC, specifically being like Black women, I think that is an area that is really difficult because mental health or self-care isn't always doing something that necessarily feels good. Sometimes it's like saying no when you don't want to, or like turning down that project when you know that you don't have the time or the energy to do it. And like that can kind of create this idea or like this stereotype that we struggle with as Black women of like not being agreeable, or like as Black people in general, like not working as hard. And so I think that can be hard because it's like our mental health, not only do we have to deal with it in education spaces and workspaces, but we also have this added layer of our race and like how we're perceived by the actions and things that we say. And so sometimes mental health is like doing a face mask and, doing your nails and like having time to like watch Netflix. Sometimes it also is, especially as BIPOC, saying no to something or knowing that you don't have the energy to do something. And I think that can be an area where it's hard to really see it as mental health, because I think sometimes social media makes it seem like, oh yeah, you just have to like get a facial and go for a walk and do things. Like sometimes it is doing the hard work so that later you're not overwhelmed or later you're not suffering from it.
Yeah, I feel like Nicole summed that up pretty nicely. But to add to that, I would just, giving yourself grace, especially when it comes to like setting those boundaries, or just like even asking for, in terms of like school, at least. My part of my journey was just like recognizing that asking for an extension is not like a bad thing. Just like taking a moment, like I literally don't have the bandwidth to do that right now. And even getting over the mental block of like, okay, it's okay to ask for grace in this moment where I'm not feeling 100%. So recognizing that, like, one, I have something in my mind that's telling me you need to finish this at midnight, when technically nothing is really that urgent. So kind of like we were talking about earlier, recognizing what triggers you, and like, why can't I ask for help? Why is it so hard for me to ask for help in this moment? So I would say that is I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry.
No, you were right at the exclamation point. Like you were there. First of all, I really appreciate how y'all are able to uh, feed off of each other by adding a different perspective to kind of the same overall concept. There's so many gems that I'm taking away from what you guys are sharing, and I think this idea of like really understanding that oftentimes it's like I don't know how to self advocate. I don't know how to advocate for myself.
Mm,
But it's like, one, reflect, take some time with
yeah.
yourself, and really, to your point, Nicole, figure out, is it that I'm depleted, and the fact that like self advocacy is saying no, and being okay with that, or to your point, self advocacy is taking time to do something for myself. But if you're always taking time to do something for yourself, but then that's automatically depleted because you are overcommitting, there's still some work that you have to do on that self advocacy journey. But I think that that part around no is so key. It's one of the hardest things to do as an advocate, is to say no, and that really is truly one of the most powerful ways to advocate for yourself. I want to talk about like support within like support systems within home, within community. Like, so talk to me about what role have family, friends, mentors, community organizers, organizations. Yeah, I mentioned Active Minds. I love it. Played in supporting your mental health journey.
For me, I would say they're pretty crucial in terms of, I'll go from like each level. So family, like I talk to my sisters like a lot, but like outside of my family, just like friends and community groups. Like when I was in undergrad, I started a club actually called Black Minds, where we were able to have mental health conversations, and in a safe space where it was specifically for students of color, just to have conversations like these and talk about like different aspects of wellness, mental health, finances, because it all encompasses our mental health. So I think community groups are an undertapped resource that I think we overlook a lot. Like, I think the first recommendation or the first thought that comes to mind when people are like, oh, I need help with my mental health, is the first thing to go to or look into might be a therapist or like a clinical aspect. And I don't think that has to be the case. I think there's a lot of power in just regular groups that might not necessarily on its face be mental health, but behind it, it's like, this is a place where you feel the most supported. This is a place where you feel the most open and comfortable. Like you might not need to go to a therapist, but this community group is providing the same benefits as therapy for you. So I think community groups are a really important and undertapped, underutilized resource.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, I think, a part of the missing piece when it comes to mental health for young people. I think, at least in the spaces that I've been in, has also been like, oh, have you looked into therapy? Have you looked into medication? Have you looked at these clinical aspects? And it's like, that is a part of mental health in a way that you can like navigate and try to kind of deal with any issues that you're dealing with. But I think also like having those community groups are important too, to feel supported and everyone's feel understood, or like they have a voice or someone hears them and like sees them. I think like your friends or even like mentors you have like at church, like for me, I have a few mentors at church who I feel incredibly supported by. And if I'm ever having a bad day, like I can call them and they very much said like my door's open, like those kinds of things. And I think having that network is important, because even with like things like therapy, you see a therapist at most like an hour a week. So like having that but no support on the outside can definitely make things difficult and you feel isolated, which is, I think, part of the reason why mental health can be so challenging, is this idea of feeling alone or not feeling understood. And having these support groups can help you kind of like mitigate that and feeling like when you're talking about certain issues, even if it's not necessarily mental health, but like, I don't know, like you're struggling with an exam or you're struggling with this, like, I don't know, like applying to college or something like that, you're talking to other people and they're going through the same kind of thing as you, that can be support in and of itself. And that can also be kind of like a proactive approach, I think, to mental health, of like talking about it when it's like, hard, but I'm managing, versus talking about it when it's like overwhelming and it's overbearing and you need to kind of seek further help. Like, I think that can kind of be a proactive approach that we don't really consider as much, because it doesn't have that banner of mental health like therapy or medication or like therapy groups kind of have.
Yeah, but like you said earlier, mental health is not mental illness necessarily. And I reflect on like this idea of mentor and like how do you make a connection with mental health. But one of the things that I really like reflected on was some of the habits that mentors modeled. And so one of them for me is like work-life balance. Like I remember being a principal and I had a couple of different mentors, and there was one mentor that was like, for the next 3 years, there is no balance. Like you're not gonna be happy for the next 3 years. This was a literal quote. And there was some, sarcasm to that, but also some truth to that. But then there were others who modeled healthy habits of setting boundaries, or like really making sure that like, okay, yes, the work is so important and the work is urgent. But like, what are the things that you can do to model healthy habits, healthy mental health habits? So I always took note of those mentors that modeled those things. And I always try to be someone that, even if I don't say it verbatim, let me model this thing for you. Um, like we're talking about support, we're talking about community. And oftentimes as BIPOC youth, we named it earlier, like sometimes that community, sometimes at home can be the barrier. So what advice do y'all give to the young person who feels alone, unheard? They're trying to advocate for their mental well-being, but they feel alone, they feel unheard. What advice do you have for them?
I think kind of as that BIPOC person growing up, like feeling like I was alone or feeling like I didn't have someone, I think the advice that I would give is kind of take it day by day, and as hard as it can be and as much labor as it is, like even if you give 2% that day to trying to find support or trying to, I don't know, find resources, that can even be the game changer. I know for me, when I had been struggling with mental health, I was looking for community, and the thought of like going to a new club or going to an organization was very scary. And so sometimes it's just like doing it. Like that's, I don't know. Like sometimes for me, one thing that I've learned this year, or I guess in January, because it's the beginning of the year, is, and this kind of goes for different aspects of my life. It's like sometimes, as hard as it is, you kind of have to just do it and kind of hope for the best. And I think also giving yourself grace if you do it and you hate it and it sucked. Like be like, okay, I tried that and it really was not what I wanted. I think there's an aspect to that, but also just having someone that is willing to do it with you. Like I think for me, one thing that kind of helped me find the church that I'm at now has been a really great support system, and people that I can go to and friends that I've made. Is like having someone being like, hey, like I'm really scared to do this. Like, would you be willing to do this with me? Even if it's like someone who is religious, like just any person that you feel close enough to be like, I'm trying to look for this thing and I'm scared to do it alone. I think that can be really helpful. And I think also one of the things that is the hardest when you feel alone is that you just feel like no one understands or that you're isolated. And that kind of like ends up being like a feedback loop of like, I feel isolated, so I'm going to isolate myself. I feel isolated, so I'm going to isolate myself. And I think kind of trying to break that by just like, sometimes what I'll do with my friends, I'm like, hey, like I don't really feel like talking, but do you want to come over and just like do work side by side? Like just having someone there and like them knowing that maybe you're not doing the best, but having someone just sit next to you and like just to know that you have that person, I think can be really helpful. But yeah, I think those are the kind of the things that I have learned and that have kind of helped me.
Yeah, I would say what you said about like the cycle of feeling isolated, so isolating yourself more. I think that's one thing I really resonate with, and recognizing that like the cycle that happens is like maybe one of the first steps, and just like taking kind of like you said, that leap of faith, but also realizing that it's hard to say because like I don't know. Like people are much friendlier sometimes than we like build up in our heads. Like we expect people to say no sometimes, but then we're so surprised when they say yes. So recognizing or just like acknowledging, taking that leap of faith that somebody might say yes, just like ask. And if that person says no, we can keep trying. Especially if you're feeling alone and isolated, it can be really hard to get out of that cycle of like, I just don't even know where to look or where to turn to. Nobody understands. There's always someone out there that will listen and wants to listen to you.
I think that's very key advice. And, I think as an educator, I always think about, okay, what roles do our school play in being that place in which, okay, I've tried to advocate for myself at home. I've taken the time to really articulate and think about the language to articulate this need in the best way possible, even try to articulate it in different ways when it comes to making a connection or communicating with my family, but then allowing school to be a place in which, okay, I know I can be heard here, and that's the first step. Now someone has heard me, someone knows my need, and using that as a platform to continue to advocate for yourself. When we think about BIPOC youth and specifically being a young person of color, like we cannot talk about mental health and really think about this idea of self-advocacy and the journey of self-advocacy and not really talk about barriers and recognize the systemic challenges that exist. So in what ways do you think mental health resources and services are lacking for BIPOC youth?
I think in terms of like services, I almost want to say for the longest time, like services or just like anything wellness, mental health related was marketed towards like people that are not BIPOC youth. Like even just for myself, like it always seemed like something for other people, not for me. So just I think there needs to be an entire shift in the way that it's approached and looked at and thought about. Like, is that even something that's available to me? Like if I go, will I be welcomed? Are there providers that look like me? Like we all know that there are not like a lot of Black mental health providers, but even outside of like the clinical aspect, are there community resources where I can go and feel safe? Like, am I going to go to like a Starbucks or a coffee shop to meet with my friends, but then am I going to be stared at by the people the entire time? So that's not helping my mental health. But yeah, I think a lot is lacking in terms of like the way society as a whole just like looks at mental health for Black people, especially when sometimes it can be what's the word, like a very narrow way where it's Black people are only associated with mental illness. But as we've established earlier, like mental illness is not just mental health. So I think a lot needs to change. And yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think that that's something that's really difficult because, like, I know for me, when I was considering the clinical route of mental health, that was a big thing for me, was like looking for mentors and like seeing that like there's not a lot of providers that look like us, and like what does that mean for mental health? Is that a space for us? And like Chigozie said, like the marketing doesn't seem like it's for us. Like if you're seeing like a picture of, like, I know in my school they had pictures of mental health services, and it's like it's always like a white therapist, and then there's like a white student like next to them, and like I feel like that even if we were not thinking about it consciously, like the more and more you see it, the more your brain's kind of like, oh, okay, maybe this isn't for us. And I think another part that's really important is the stigma within a lot of Black communities. Like I know for me, talking about mental health with a lot of like my friends or people growing up, it was very much like, oh, that's not a Black person problem. Like that's like a white person problem. Like that's not something that we deal with, or like it's almost like an excuse for like bad behavior, an excuse for not doing as well in school. Like it doesn't seem like it's a legitimate issue. It's more of like, oh, you're trying to excuse something else that you can control when it comes to illness specifically. And I think that that's a big issue. This idea of like, if we can't even like acknowledge it as being real, like where do we even start with support or resources within like our communities? And I think that that's a place that needs to start of like understanding what mental health is in Black communities, and also like, I don't know, just understanding it more in terms of health, because I think I like saw this thing on like social media, which is probably very popular. This idea of like, when you like break your toe, no one's like making you feel bad for breaking your toe. You go to the doctor. Like that idea of like, when it comes to physical health, we're just so quick to like, oh no, this is serious. We give it so much weight. When it's mental health, it's like, because you can't see it, or because we don't, like, a lot of communities, there isn't a lot of education. It's like, oh, that's like not something we do. Like, what is this? It doesn't seem real. I think that can be a real barrier, because I think even like our parent generations, like there's definitely people who struggle with mental health, and they just like think that they're doing bad at life, or they're not good at their job or whatever, without really understanding that maybe they're struggling, or maybe they just don't have the work-life balance, or maybe they don't have a safe space to be at home, and like that's contributing to how they feel. Like those kinds of things aren't really talked about, because we don't first acknowledge that mental health even exists, or something that needs to be nurtured.
You both are giving me so much to think about. I mean, with my own journey, but then I think about being a father, and I'm like, okay, what are some of the things that I need to set up and put in practice and do and even talk about with my child in order to kind of, one, make sure that as a young BIPOC youth, they understand that mental health is a priority, but two, that they're able to like take ownership of it the way that you both have. And again, self-advocacy is a journey. This hasn't happened overnight, but you two are very, very powerful individuals. So let's talk to the people who are similar to y'all, and they are looking for ways to move forward. They're looking for ways to make an impact. What advice would you give to other young people who want to advocate for mental health in their communities and in their schools?
I think this is something that I love the question, because I think that's something that I struggled with in college, because I knew that I wanted to do psychology, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a therapist, or like what that looked like. And I think the biggest thing that I learned like through Active Minds in my internship and in college was that you can be an advocate for mental health in any field you're in. Like for me, I want to go into healthcare, and kind of either as a practitioner or thinking about policy or case management, like those kinds of things. And so for me, going into healthcare, I was like, oh, well, I'm not going to get to do that work, like, because it's just so strictly healthcare. But like for me, I'm taking the approach of like, I want to look at healthcare as holistically. When I'm going to a patient, I don't want to just ask them about the surgery they just had and like how they're healing. But I want to ask, like, how have you been feeling lately? How is like people been treating you here at the hospital, like those kinds of things, and making it holistic. So there's like so many ways where you can bring mental health into like any sphere, any career that you're going to go into, whether it's corporate and like you end up being like top ladder manager and things like that. It's like creating a space where it is clear that mental health is important in the place that you work, and like there are resources available for employees. Like you can be an advocate in any way. And I think knowing that opens up so many doors beyond just clinical, which is amazing work. But if that isn't like your calling, like there's so many other ways to be that advocate, or just being an advocate in terms of like your relationships with your friends or your family, being that listening ear, being someone that has awareness to resources in your area, I think is a big deal, because it can really create like a change in someone's life. Like for instance, here at UVA, like there are so many resources that I'm just now learning about them. Like I wish I would have known I was in college, or been able to tell someone about, like, even free counseling, which is like such a good thing, especially for BIPOC students and people with like low income communities. Like those are things that exist, but people also just don't know about them. Or like how we've been talking about like community groups. Like there's so many community groups that I've learned about. Like one of the classes I'm taking at the school, they have like a group for people whose first language isn't English, and they're Spanish speakers, and like going and practicing English with each other and like talking about their experiences. Like all these things exist, and all of these things are great resources, but if people don't know about them, then there's not really much you can do. So maybe being that person that knows about them too is a way to be an advocate.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of answering that question. But just to add on, I think being an advocate can also be like the little things. I think you kind of already touched on that. But for so many times, for a lot of people, I think we kind of get caught in the cycle of like, I don't want to generalize. I get caught in the cycle of like, oh, like it's just a small action. Like it doesn't mean anything. It means something. Like being an advocate, like you said, can literally just be asking someone how their day was and taking the time to listen, like walking down the street, or maybe like listening to your friend with no earpods or AirPods, like making yourself open to conversation. I think a lot of times in society, that's something that we kind of forget about. But yeah, I think being an advocate can look like so many different things, and it doesn't have to be you organizing a neighborhood event. It can literally just be you listening to a stranger.
I mean, we can't all be mental health professionals, but we can all be mental health advocates. Like we can all be mental health advocates. So I think that was very profound. But kind of getting to a close, I want to kind of close out on kind of two reflections. One, allowing y'all to speak to someone who may be listening, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to speak to your younger self with a question. But to close out, I'm willing to bet that there's a young person of color, a BIPOC youth, who's listening to this conversation, who will listen to this conversation, and they're struggling with their mental health, and they may be afraid to speak up. What is your message? What is something you want to share with that person?
I think I would say you're worth being listened to. What you have to say and what you have to share matters. So don't be afraid to put yourself out there and share what you're going through, because your experience, it's important, and it's who you are, or not who you are, but like it's what you're going through. So don't be afraid to share and get over that mental voice telling you you're alone, because you're not alone. We're here if you're listening.
Yeah, I think for me, this question is, I don't know, kind of like hits close to home, because I remember what it was like struggling with my own mental health and thinking like, it doesn't get better. Like, this is just how it's going to be. This is maybe what my life is going to look like. And like, as hard as it was to hear when people would tell me it's going to get better, it's going to get better, it gets better, even if it's day by day, 1% of it getting better, like it does get better. And I never would have thought that I'd be like on a podcast talking about mental health and self-advocacy. Like, even doing this has just shown me like how much I've grown in like navigating my own struggles and trying to be someone who is an advocate for mental health, not just in my career, but in my everyday life. So I think just remembering that how you feel today isn't how you're going to feel forever. I think that was the biggest piece of advice for me. Like, how you feel even 20 minutes ago isn't how you feel right now. So like, how can how you feel today be how you feel for the rest of your life? Like, things shift, your circumstances can shift. Like, there's like so much of what you do that can be in your control, even with the barriers that we all face. Like, as Black women, like there's a lot of barriers that we face, and like there are still like ways that we can overcome them because of the strength that we have and like our experiences and the things we've gone through. And I think just remembering that things can change, and like that doesn't mean that it necessarily be amazing, but it can be a little bit better than it is today. So I think that just remembering that it does get better.
And y'all are so wise, so profound, so in tune that I don't even need to ask this last question. This last question was kind of around like, what advice would you give to your younger self around navigating mental health and self-advocacy? But I believe the message that you just shared with that BIPOC youth who may be feeling afraid to speak up is what you would have said to your younger self. And I think that's so important. You have the right to speak up. You are not alone. If you're listening to this conversation, we are here for you. There's so many ways that you can get plugged into Active Minds. Nicole, Chigozie, I cannot thank you enough. I'm looking back at my notes, and there's some things that I'm just going to walk away with. One of them is representation matters. In order to, feel like you have access to the service, or you have a right to the service, you need to see yourself within those services. So I thank both of you for the journey that you're on, not just as mental health advocates, but you are also entering the field in a lot of different ways. And that representation matters, and you guys are going to have an amazing impact. Another one was mental health is a basic need. So if you're listening to this, mental health is a part of your basic needs. Don't let anybody tell you differently. Mental health is not mental illness. Mental health is not mental illness. So if you're a young BIPOC person listening to this conversation, your mental health doesn't necessarily mean that you have a mental illness. You have a right to advocate for yourself. I really, really, really appreciate all that y'all shared. I think the last thing that I want to leave everyone with is one of the most profound things that I think came out of this conversation that was a repeated theme of your self-advocacy was around, if you don't have a safe space, you have the right to advocate for one, and you have the right to create your own. Nicole, Chigozie, thank you so much. We got to do this again. I'm just about to say that. we really have to do this again. I'm honored to have a conversation with y'all. I'm supporting you and rooting y'all as y'all continue y'all journeys. And I want to thank you for being the leaders, being the advocates that you are. Y'all truly set an example for all of us.
Oh, thank you for creating the space to have the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I definitely hope that there's BIPOC students that can hear this and feel what we're saying and like tune into this. So
No, I'm certain that this will be impactful and help many. So like I said, I look forward to doing this again in the future.